This is the U.S. Report with James Morrow.
Good evening and welcome to this very special edition of the U.S. Report on this historic day in American history. The Star Chamber, the court, has delivered its verdict and will bring you a full hour of analysis on this astonishing result in the Stormy Daniels-Donald Trump hush money case. We're going to break down what this means for Trump's election campaign, Joe Biden's campaign, the U.S. justice system, Trump's other trials, sentencing, and so much more. So let's get right into it. Again, today, Donald J. Trump found guilty on 34 counts of illegally trying to cover up payments to porn star Stormy Daniels to stifle her claims of an affair with Trump. And thus, prosecutors in deeply Democrat New York City said, interfere with the 2016 election. And there is no getting around this fact. This is absolutely historic, but not necessarily for the reasons that are being touted in much of the media. Yes, this is absolutely the first time that a former president has ever been convicted of a felony. It's wild stuff, and the American legal system, American politics have now moved into seriously uncharted territory. Again, a former president charged with bookkeeping crimes from a decade ago. And have no doubt that he would never have been prosecuted were he not running for president, and in the process threatening the Democrats' hold on the White House. I'm going to walk you through just how political this all is in a moment. But first, let's have a look at what Donald Trump had to say about the verdict after it was handed down.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace.
So if they thought this verdict would get Trump to finally back down, well, not so fast. Now, let's go through a few things about these charges. Number one, Donald Trump is no ordinary former president. He's not off writing his memoirs. He's attempting a comeback, and he is still in the box seat to win back the White House in November. Number two, this prosecution here is one of 4 attempts by prosecutors to take down Trump, to damage him, possibly incarcerate him, and certainly try to make him an unviable candidate in November. I mean, again, it is absolutely extraordinary that Trump was charged for this. Seriously, covering up an affair in politics is somehow subverting an election? If this was true, they would have locked up Bill Clinton and a million other politicians and thrown away the key years ago. And speaking of Clintons, the crux of this case, that a payment to get Stormy Daniels to shut up about claims of an affair with Trump was funneled through a lawyer and not entered right into the books, well, this crime, alleged crime, convicted crime, is precisely what Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign paid a fine for when she was caught out using her law firm, Perkins Coie, to pay for the notorious Steele dossier that claimed Donald Trump was a Russian agent and much else besides. A document that I think was probably a far greater attempt to subvert an election and attack our democracy than any attempt by Trump's people to cover up an alleged affair. This, of course, being something else Hillary Clinton would have had a fair bit of experience with via her husband Bill, who, as Hillary herself once said, was a hard dog to keep on the porch. But let's get back to the Get Trump effort. This whole thing has been clearly coordinated by the Biden White House, the Democrat Party, and proxies such as George Soros to nobble Trump's chances. There's tons of direct evidence for this. For example, in the classified documents case, Julie Kelly from Real Clear Wire has reported that, quote, top Biden administration officials worked with the National Archives to develop special counsel Jack Smith's case against Donald Trump involving the former president's alleged mishandling of classified material, according to recently unsealed court documents in the case pending in southern Florida, unquote. And we also know how the prosecutor in this case, the hush money case, District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who is more than happy to let violent criminals run loose on the streets of New York, explicitly ran on a Get Trump ticket. Members of his team were part of the Democratic political machine. One even worked for Barack Obama. And we also know that Judge Juan Merchan has strong links to the Democrats, and his daughter does tens of millions of dollars in work for Democrat Party clients. But there is a final point here that absolutely cannot be ignored, and that is this. Remember, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, it was the left, the Democrats, who launched a full-court press to deny the election against the legitimacy of what they now call our democracy. That Steele dossier I mentioned before was an entire effort to prove that Trump occupied the White House illegitimately. Hillary Clinton herself said it. Trump is not legitimate.
I believe he knows he's an illegitimate president. He knows that there were a bunch of different reasons why the election turned out the way it did.
Yeah, so she lost not because she ran a lousy campaign or she was unlikable. He was just illegitimate. So since then, the Democrats, the left, have been trying to delegitimize Trump ever since that occurred. And as such, there's kind of a neat circularity here with this verdict. I mean, it's, in a sense, the Clintons finally getting their revenge, using, of all things, claims that trying to shut up an ex amounted to election interference. You can't make this stuff up. The Democrats are going to run hard on this, obviously, and say, oh, how can you vote for Donald Trump? He's a felon, 34 felony convictions. But in the end, it may not matter. In fact, I don't think it will. It is not hard to see how Trump will, in fact, and he's already started, to spin this into a win. The guilty verdict plays directly into Trump's narrative that the Democrats are determined to shut him down by corrupting the courts and distracting the country with show trials, as opposed to, running a candidate who is not moving through the early stages of dementia at a rate of knots, or selling policies that stop the endless influx of illegal immigration, the endless upward spiral of prices, and the endless downward spiral of endless wars and global conflict. Remember, here is what Americans are saying outside of the Trump trial about what life is like under Joe Biden.
People are struggling. We have to help people extra with groceries, gas prices.
How do the prices feel to you lately?
High. Food is a lot more expensive.
Most normal people are pushed out of buying.
Whether housing, whether you're renting, everything's increasing.
Oh, it's outrageous right now. At this point, we're saying that we're probably not going to be able to move.
Rooney won't vote for Biden again.
I can't. I don't trust him with the economy. My son's in the Army. I'm angry about Afghanistan, about that withdrawal. So honestly, I can't vote for him.
So given all this, it's no surprise to me that despite all the media outrage, during the trial, polls did not move.
But apparently it's 44 days. You cracked the numbers. You've run the numbers. All right, let's take a look here. Think Trump did something illegal in the New York hush money case. I've been interested in whether or not these numbers would change at all during the course of this trial. Simply put, John, they have not. Pre-opening statements think Trump did something illegal, 46%. After the direct examination of Michael Cohen by the prosecution, look at where we are now, 46%. The percentage of Americans who think that the charges are very serious, in fact, dropped from 40% to a little bit more than 35% during the course of this trial. So, yes, perhaps things might have changed with those 12 jurors, but when it comes to the larger American public, there has been no change, at least so far, John.
Gee, I wonder why Americans haven't been buying into this. Maybe it's because they see the trial as a political show trial. Maybe they see it as a distraction. But I would add one more thing. I think they also see Democrats as being caught in a paradox of their own making. Consider this. If Trump is really so awful, if he is really such an absolutely existential threat to democracy, America, the world, if all the stops must be pulled out, getting rid of judicial integrity, media fairness, everything else, to make sure he doesn't come back to power, why are the Democrats so determined to burn down the entire constitutional village in order to save the country, instead of simply doing the obvious, which is, instead of running Joe Biden, putting up a candidate who is not falling apart before our eyes? Let's cross to Washington, D.C., where Sky News Washington correspondent Annalise Nielsen joins us. Annalise Nielsen, we saw a defiant Donald Trump hours ago coming out of the courthouse, and we also saw prosecutor Alvin Bragg make these comments about what the jury decided. Have a look.
The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. And while this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor.
So Annalise Nielsen, the prosecutor there, just said that they brought this case essentially without fear or favor. But in America right now, are people really believing that this case on esoteric bookkeeping charges would have been brought had the defendant's name not been Donald J. Trump, candidate for president?
Well, don't forget as well, before this, his predecessor wouldn't bring this case, and they had to pick up a bit of novel law that hasn't been used before. So it's a bit of a interpretation there to say that they just followed the law. No, they really worked at getting this done. Which is their right as a prosecutor. Sure, these are laws that are on the books, but they had to try something new to get this done. And so I think a lot of people across America, and the polls are reflecting this, aren't convinced that they have changed their mind because of this. So what we're seeing is people who were voting Republican anyway are now more supportive of Donald Trump. People who were voting Democrat anyway hate him even more than they did before. And so really there's just this small fraction of independent voters, and there's still not a clear-cut decision of how this is going to impact them down the road. And I think, too, we're talking about just being 5 months out away from the election, but that's a long time for the rest of the world who doesn't follow politics day to day, who have very cemented ideas about both of the leaders. Whether they like them or not is one thing, but people have their opinions of them is the real point to be looked at here.
Yeah, and Annalise, what's been the reaction just in the immediate, minutes and hours after that verdict came down? Cheers, jeers. It must have been very emotional both for people on the left and the right.
Well, what's interesting is we haven't seen much of a scene outside of court. There was a big increase in security, and from the reports that we're getting from outside of the court, it doesn't seem like there was any big show. What we're not seeing is anyone really coming out and doing the victory lap yet, although I'm sure that will come. But what we have seen is senior Republicans backing Donald Trump in. We've seen Speaker Mike Johnson immediately put out a statement criticizing this entire case and calling it an abuse of power. We've seen Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, who's widely touted as being one of the top picks for his vice president, putting a very fierce statement out criticizing this. Donald Trump's not going anywhere for the Republicans. This case doesn't mean he's going anywhere for this upcoming election. And when we're talking about the theoretical prospect of him being in a jail cell, it would take an extraordinary read of the sentencing guidelines to put him in a jail cell. I think that would have a real chance of just inflaming the supporters of Donald Trump even more than they already are.
Annalise Nielsen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and bringing us this breaking news out of New York City. Thanks for your time, Annalise Nielsen. Okay, now to break down more of what this means for the Trump camp, let's bring in former Donald Trump senior advisor Christian Whitten. Christian, thank you so much for coming on the U.S. Report on this historic day. First of all, I want to get your reaction to the verdict that was handed down in New York.
Well, the verdict's an outrage, I think. You know, it was a crime that was ill-defined. It looked all along as if it were a kangaroo court. The outcome was preordained. The jury was chosen in one of the most liberal jurisdictions in the United States, and it was for charges that the federal government, that the people in charge of elections declined to pursue. So I think it helps the Trump campaign. I spoke to a number of officials who were close to the former president and involved informally with the campaign, and there was a sense of almost excitement that this is actually going to further excite the base and prove to people that the administration, that the powers that be in the U.S., that the judicial system is being politicized because there's desperation to keep Joe Biden in the White House despite a miserable record. So there's disappointment that you have this politicization of the justice system, but the belief that this actually helps the president.
But Christian, you know, you've worked with the former president, and we saw him before looking very defiant, but also very angry, I'd have to say, about what has been handed down here. How do you think that he is personally reacting and feeling about what has happened today?
Yeah, it's usually not a big mystery what President Trump is doing. I mean, he's usually very candid about his beliefs on social media. So very angry and disappointed. I think, you know, there was some thought that at least you'd have a hung jury, that at least some of the jurors would be skeptical. After all, they had to ask for the judge to read his convoluted instructions back again. But I think you'll see a resolve. Also, this is, you know, this is the last trial that will play out before the election. So who knows what this judge, who's a very politicized judge, will do, whether he'll try and keep Trump in New York as sentencing matters are addressed, or whether this now just gets turned over broadly to the public. You know, I think you'll see a very, very determined president. The question is whether he decides to be magnanimous to his former home state of New York, or whether he chooses to be vengeful once in office. It's very easy for a president to start pulling back some of the many federal funds that New York City relies on to operate, to stay viable.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned, though, the political nature of this trial, and this stood out to me, and I want to get your reaction, because an awful lot of people are saying, and Alvin Bragg, the DA, has said, this isn't about politics, this is just about following the law, and yet they've set sentencing for July 11th, just a few days before Trump is to be confirmed officially as the Republican nominee at the Republican National Convention. Does that data point to you kind of give away the game that this is really about, well, what they're accusing Trump of, election interference?
Exactly. It is election interference. This seems like an expedited basis. Usually there's a significant amount of time between, especially on a novel case like this, without precedent. You think there would be a significant amount of time between conviction and sentencing. This is what the Biden administration is counting on. They're hoping against hope that this is going to have some sort of effect that Biden has been unable to achieve. He's below water in all of the polls, the economy, foreign policy, the direction of the country. People still blame him for inflation. They blame him for a lower quality of life. And yeah, it looks just like it's ongoing politics by this judge and by the other judges in cases against Trump.
Do you think that voters, though, I mean, in the Trump camp, in their discussions about going forward, this badge, they're going to hang this, you know, Donald Trump is a felon badge on the former president as he campaigns. Now, clearly he doesn't think this is going to hurt him, and in fact, it may help him. But is there a danger at all that some people will look at this and say, well, Trump's got these troubles, Biden is a mess for a whole number of other reasons, but we're just going to wind up staying home? Is there a turnout issue that you're concerned about here, an enthusiasm gap?
Not an enthusiasm gap. There were polls that were taken sort of generically before. If there were a candidate who were a convicted felon, would you be less likely to vote for him? And people did say yes, they would be less likely to vote. However, now that you're into a specific case of Trump being convicted of these very difficult to understand fraud charges, convictions now, I don't think you'll have that effect. And in fact, the base, I think, will be very, very fired up. And also the new voters that Donald Trump has had success in bringing into the Republican fold, especially blacks and Latinos. Certainly within the black community, there is a current of injustice and of reaction to that. And in that case, you may have more black sympathy for Donald Trump in seeing that he has been persecuted and had the judicial system used against him. And if you look at swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan in particular, Ohio's not really a swing state anymore. That's more reliably Republican. They're not black majority states, but a significant black vote. And the Democrats have been terrified that that voting bloc that they've taken for granted seems to be eroding. And Donald Trump isn't necessarily winning a majority, but certainly among black men is doing better. And in fact, that this case, this sense of persecution of someone who's being treated unfairly and of a choice that's being taken away or trying to be taken away from voters and given to officials, actually, again, will help Donald Trump.
Christian Whitten, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time on this historic day.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Joining us now is Carol Markowitz, New York Post columnist and host of the Carol Markowitz Show. Carol, thank you so much for coming on the program here. Historic, huge day. You used to live in New York. As an ex-New Yorker, what is your reaction to how New Yorkers are going to react at seeing the way that the justice system behaved here in the Donald Trump hush money case?
Well, very nice to see you. Thank you for having me on. It's hard to say because the New York that I grew up in, the New York that I knew so well, would have reacted one way. But the New York that I've seen since COVID, since 2020, is really something else entirely. I have to tell you, I actually saw Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago maybe 2 or 3 years ago now in South Florida, where we both live. And he said to me, you know, he recognized me from my Post column and he said, "Can you believe New York forced us out?" And that's exactly what happened. It became a city of mean, angry, you know, Karens who were just wanting to bend everything to their will. And this is sort of the latest example of that. I'm very disappointed in a New York jury finding him guilty. I would love to hear from the jurors or from regular New Yorkers. I tweeted this, but I'd love to hear from men on the street. What do they think? What is the crime that they think Trump committed here? It is so difficult to understand. I listen to legal minds all day trying to explain this, and it's a tough one. It's not so clear. It's not just, oh, he paid hush money. So I think that the fact is that this was a political persecution. It was absolutely aimed at harming Donald Trump's chances in this election. I don't know that will happen. It might. Anybody who says that they know how a presidential candidate being convicted of a felony is going to play out in the election is lying. So we'll have to see what happens from here. But it was absolutely politics-based, and it's very unfortunate to watch my city become like that.
Well, yeah, look, I agree with you, Carol, as a former New Yorker myself. But the question, too, is, you know, on these charges, I think the fact that Alvin Bragg let so many criminals out on the streets, essentially, and that New York has become this, you know, incredibly unsafe place. We see the videos of it all the time. We see the headlines, and we see people prosecuted either for standing up for themselves or for other people, or in the Trump case for essentially the crime of, you know, embarrassing Joe Biden. Surely people cannot buy that Alvin Bragg is not a political prosecutor.
Right. He didn't suddenly become very concerned about crime only when Donald Trump is concerned. It's exactly what you said. He's the type of prosecutor who does not prosecute crime, and yet he's found something to pin on Donald Trump, and he went for it. The fact that he succeeded again is very unfortunate. I think that we're going to see other prosecutions like this because, look, it doesn't only go one way. Obviously, Republicans are going to take the message that they should prosecute any Democrats who are, you know, even borderline tied to any crime. So this is going to get into a tit for tat. I don't necessarily think that that's wrong either. I think that that's the way to end this kind of behavior, to show that both sides are capable of it. For a long time, only the Democrats have been.
Yeah, and though also just on the subject of New York and the voters, on the one hand, yes, okay, fine, it's become horribly crime-ridden and, as you say, a big city of Karens. But also last week we did see the extraordinary scenes out of the Bronx where Donald Trump went, and tens of thousands of people, ordinary New Yorkers, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, showed up in their numbers to support Trump. So is there a chance that maybe part of New York is actually on Trump's side here in this one?
Well, absolutely. I grew up in South Brooklyn. That's a very red Republican area. I grew up in a very immigrant-heavy area. Immigrants tend to be conservative. So these are absolutely New York voters who are voting for Trump. And he got a lot, even when you just look at the numbers, he got like 30% of the vote in New York last time, maybe a little bit higher than that. And that's a significant number of people, even though obviously that doesn't win you the state. So it becomes interesting to watch what he ended up doing in the Bronx and how many people did show up for him. The real interesting thing to me there isn't that there's so many people voting for Trump. Again, I think just numbers wise, they were always Trump voters in New York. We just don't really hear from them. The thing was that they were doing it in public with the MAGA hat on in the Bronx, saying, I don't care who recognizes me. I don't care who goes to my boss. I don't care which Karen sees me on TV. I'm going to support this man. So it's a bit, that was very encouraging to see that they weren't afraid anymore.
Absolutely. That's always the crucial question. Carol Markowitz, thank you so much for joining us on the U.S. Report, reader in the New York Post, and check out the Carol Markowitz Show. Now, we're going to go to a break with more verdict analysis coming up soon after that. But first, I've got to share this one with you. A new Donald Trump ad has also just dropped today. And I tell you what, I wonder if this show here doesn't have a new fan.
Thank you for joining us here today. Earlier this afternoon, Donald Trump was arraigned by a Manhattan grand jury on 34 felony counts.
This case is an abomination. It's obviously political. 7 years to try to come up with this case. They're just wrong on the law.
The only crime that Donald Trump is being prosecuted for is the crime of running for president.
Political persecution at the highest level.
They've quite frankly given up on trying to beat him at the polls. Either going to steal it or stop it by lawfare.
A Democrat prosecutor elected on a Get Trump platform. Hey, I know that guy. Thanks for watching, Mr. President. We'll come back to the guilty verdict after the break. Hey there, welcome back to the program. I'm James Morrow, and in a moment, Batya Ungar-Sargon is going to join us on this historic day to talk about the astonishing verdict in Trump's criminal trial, the hush money trial of Stormy Daniels, and how this represents a revolt of the elite against normal Americans. But before we get to that, why don't we do something we haven't done for a while? Let's play a game of Joe versus reality. Let's go to an event which happened just a day or two ago where a fit and vigorous Joe Biden talked about, among other things, that catastrophic disaster earlier this year when that cargo ship hit the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. Have a listen.
And look at all that's been changed. For example, the bridge went down over the Chesapeake, and we were there the next day. It was the governor.
Nope, wrong-o. Sorry, Mr. President. The record shows you did not go there the next day, but instead didn't visit the site of the disaster for more than a week. Joe Biden also said that he got deeply involved in the civil rights movement when he was a kid.
So I got involved as a kid in the civil rights movement because the Philadelphians know this, at least the older ones do. Delaware was the only city in a state in the nation, Wilmington the only city in America, occupied by the military for 9 months after Dr. King was assassinated.
And he even repeated the claim.
Like I said, in 1969, I got involved deeply in the civil rights movement. In And those of you Pennsylvanians know that Delaware used to be a slave state and a southern state.
So fit, so vigorous. But as Joe Biden himself said back in 1987, he was not an activist.
I was not out marching. I was not down in Selma. I was not anywhere else. I was a suburbanite kid who got a dose of exposure to what was happening to black Americans when I, in my own city, worked there, the only white employee, as the only white lifeguard in this, the 13 or 14 lifeguards, to find out that many of these guys lived in that city their whole life, a small city, and never knew a white man.
Ah, the lifeguard story. Was this the origin of the great legend of Corn Pop?
Corn Pop was a bad dude, and he ran a bunch of bad boys. And and back in those days, to show how things have changed, one of the things you had to use, if you used pomade in your hair, you had to wear a bathing cap. And so he was up on the board, wouldn't listen to me. I said, hey, Esther, you, off the board, or I'll come up and drag you off.
Anyway, you know the rest. Don't go putting your razor blades in the rain barrel, getting them rusty. Not a joke. All right, now back to serious matters. Joining us now is the great friend of the show, Newsweek opinion editor Batya Ungar-Sargon. Batya, thanks so much for joining us just hours after this incredible verdict in the hush money case. First of all, what is your reaction to this case, how it came down, and how the jury went guilty on 34 felonies that seem to have been spun out of a single misdemeanor?
Thank you so much for having me, James. If I tell you my initial reaction, you'll never have me back because I should really have my journalist card revoked. I was shocked. I was certain that the jury could see through this nonsense. I mean, there were 2 lawyers on the jury. I was completely convinced that when they said that they had a verdict, it was going to be to acquit him on all counts. And so I'm deeply ashamed of that, of having so misread this Manhattan jury. I mean, I guess I was still in the mindset of sort of the Trump in the Bronx rally, where you really had this amazing reaction to him from locals. But I guess this was just a very different type of New Yorker.
Well, yeah, and I mean, this brings up another question. It ties into something we've spoken a lot about. How much of this case and the verdict of it, you know, this is basically, it all goes back to that 2016 election, which the left lost their minds over and are still obviously not over. How much of this is kind of a revolt of the elites against ordinary Americans?
Oh, it's entirely that. And, you know, people on the right tend to think that, you know, this is all coordinated. Joe Biden is giving directives to the Justice Department and, you know, to the Russiagate hoax and here and there, and that it's all sort of coming from the top. The truth is actually much more sinister, which is that each of these people, each of these district attorneys and judges and people in the deep state and people in professional jobs have main character syndrome coupled with elite class solidarity. And that is what you're really seeing here. Alvin Bragg is the perfect example of this. Nobody told him to do that, I don't think. I just don't think that that happened because I don't think that that was necessary, James. And the truth is actually much more dangerous for our country, which is that there are all of these self-appointed little Eichmanns, you know, sitting there thinking that it is their job to personally rid this country of the person who represents the working class, because it is a revolt of the working class against the elites. That's what Donald Trump represents. And so you have all of these people who are behaving in a coordinated, zombified way against him, but it comes down to class solidarity of the elites against the everyman.
Well, this is a fascinating thing, too, because before the verdict came down, we saw this amazing scene where Robert De Niro, you know, who's played a lot of everyman characters but is filthy, stinking rich, he launched a tirade against Donald Trump outside the hush money court this week. Have a look at this.
Donald Trump wants to destroy not only the city, but the country, and eventually he could destroy the world.
I mean, this is this level of hysteria. A, that he's going to destroy the world, but B, why is it that the Democrats and the left, somebody said this to me earlier this week, they said, why do they always go for celebrities? It feels like they're really talking down to ordinary Americans when they do this.
It's so amazing because the trajectory of that Robert De Niro appearance was the trajectory of the Democrats, right? He starts out acting like he is the hero of the everyman, when in fact he is unbelievably wealthy. He then proceeds to lecture them that they should choose his preferred candidate, and that the preferred candidate of the American working class is a danger to this country, when the truth is, it's a danger to him and his wealth. And then when they don't like it, right, there were all of these New Yorkers yelling at him and honking their horns and fighting with him. He then just descends into screaming and name calling and finally just starts saying F you, F you, F you, which is, of course, what the Democrats have done, right? They started out pretending to be the champions of labor, right? They then oversaw this massive class divide and massive income inequality to where they became the party of the rich and the educated and abandoned the working class. And when the working class refused to simply take it lying down and found a champion for themselves in Donald Trump, the Democrats called them deplorables, basically cursed them out, said, screw you, right? We're going to take him down by any means necessary.
So, Batya, I got to ask this question then. Given all of that, given the way the classes are sort of realigning in America, and given the very political nature of this prosecution, I mean, seriously, business records from nearly a decade ago being jimmied with, I mean, honestly, has Trump actually wound up with this verdict secured his chances at re-election?
I didn't see how he could lose before the verdict, and it's even harder to see that now. I mean, anything is possible. We're still, 4 months out or what have you. He hasn't picked a VP yet. We don't know who he's going to pick as a running mate. Anything could happen, but his website is crashing right now. It's not accepting more donations because so many people are rushing to donate. I know people were reaching out to me and saying, I've never once voted, I'm voting for him, or I've never voted for a Republican, I'm voting for him, or I was lukewarm on him and now I would go to the ends of the earth to vote for this man. People understand that if he simply packed up and went home and said, I'm no longer running for president, all of these problems would go away, and yet he still shows up day after day after day. I mean, I think that really means something to people.
Batya Ungar-Sargon, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights on this very historic day. We're going to come back and talk to you again in the weeks to come. Now, in a moment, don't go away, because we're going to come back with John Fund. He's going to walk us through all the polls and what this verdict means to them. But first, it turns out that not every celebrity is woke and anti-Trump. I mean, yes, Robert De Niro made headlines around the world with his rant, but what about Dennis Quaid? Turns out he's all in with the MAGA types, apparently, as he revealed to Piers Morgan. And just wait till you hear how he explains the way he manages to deal with some of Donald Trump's behavior.
Well, I think in this election, everybody's got to, I think that you're going to take a side or whatever, but it just seems to me, it just makes sense. I was ready not to vote for Trump until what I saw is more than politics. I see a weaponization of our justice system.
Yeah.
And a challenge to our Constitution, us as Americans, that I don't think we're going to have. And, Trump is the most investigated person probably in the history of the world. And they haven't been able to really get him. People might call him an asshole, but he's my asshole.
Time for another eensy-weensy quick little break, and when we come back, pollster extraordinary John Fund to break down what Trump's conviction means in the polls. Welcome back to the program. Now, we're going to bring in great friend of the show, political journalist John Fund, to talk about all the polls and what they mean and what's going to happen now that we've had this extraordinary Trump guilty verdict in the Stormy Daniels hush money case. John Fund, thank you so much for joining me tonight on the U.S. Report. Want to get your reaction, first of all, just as somebody who's followed politics for decades, what is your reaction to seeing a former president, and not only a former president, but also a presidential candidate, now convicted successfully of these 34 felony counts. Do you think this holds water with the American people?
Not this case. Of the 4 indictments against Donald Trump, this is clearly the weakest. I want to broaden the discussion beyond this trial because this is part of a pattern and practice. In 2016, we saw people in America so distressed, so furious that Donald Trump might become president, that they convinced our intelligence agencies to step outside the dotted lines of their behavior and launch investigations of Trump, basically trying to entrap him. We saw a dossier paid for by Hillary Clinton that was pushed forward by the media that contained completely fallacious information. That was 2016. Trump won. So in 2020, we had COVID, and we turned election month and turned election day into election month. COVID allowed the Democrats and election officials and health officials all over the country to change decades and decades of practice as to the validity of early voting and mail-in voting, which is much less secure than normal voting at the polls. And we had a tsunami of mail-in ballots that were not properly scrutinized. We still don't know who won that election. We do know that that was completely out of the ordinary, and it was done without a single state legislature validating it. It was all done in the name of fighting COVID, even though it had nothing to do with that. So now we go to 2024, and we have lawfare now being used, the weaponization of the judicial system against the president and the presidential candidate. And as I've said to you in the past, I think that some of these cases against Donald Trump have some water, like the documents case, where he may have obstructed justice. But this case was ridiculous. Well, we're going to hear for the next 5 months, 34 convictions, 34 felonies. No, this was one felony. It's just that the installments that Trump used to pay Michael Cohen, his fixer, he did that 34 times. So that meant 34 counts. It's not 34 felonies. It's 34 installment payments.
And John Fund, you mentioned before that 2016 dossier, the Steele dossier. I mentioned that at the top of the program, but it does seem to me that there's an incredible circularity here, because didn't the Hillary campaign itself pay a fine for the way in which it used its lawyers to pay for that and hide the payment, which is precisely, apparently, what Donald Trump is accused of and convicted of doing. And I would say that that might have had just a little bit of an effect on influencing that election.
I suspect if you had had the same investigative resources deployed against Hillary Clinton and trying to turn someone in her employment against her, you probably would have succeeded, and you could have seen a completely unjustified, completely ridiculous prosecution of Hillary Clinton for that. And by the way, again, if anything was done improper, it was a misdemeanor. The real disaster of this case is twisting the law in such a way, like a pretzel, to turn misdemeanors into felonies is a dangerous precedent which should worry every American.
And so, given the danger of that, how tuned in are people to what these charges are? How tuned in are they to the idea that this should actually make them, if they're considering voting for Trump, or if they are going to vote for Trump, that they shouldn't? Will this move the polls at all?
Well, the best and most recent poll we have is an NPR poll, which is certainly not a conservative outlet. It found that 67% of voters say this will make no difference in their decision in November. 17% say it will make them less likely to vote for Trump. 15% more likely to vote for Trump. Now, obviously, before an event happens, you can't always predict in advance how the event itself might shape opinion. And I do believe that in the end, when all this washes out, it will be a slight net negative for Trump, because there will be some independents and some moderate Republicans who say, it's just too much to ask me to vote for someone who, quote, is a convicted felon, unquote. So I don't think it's a game changer, as the Democrats would hope, but I do think it also will, I hope, lead to a national debate that this is not about Donald Trump. This is not about Joe Biden. This is about whether or not we're going to conduct our presidential elections way outside the box of what the normal process was, and bring in tactics and methods which are abhorrent to a country that prides itself on the rule of law.
John Fund, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time on this very historic evening. Now, don't go anywhere because Only in America is next. But before that, another chapter in the amazing red pill transformation of Democrat Senator John Fetterman, who, it turns out, who knew, actually did go to Harvard. Well, anyway, the senator was invited to speak at the Yeshiva University in New York commencement ceremony this week. And it turns out he's not so proud of his Harvard education anymore. And he proved it.
25 years ago, and I was graduating from Harvard University. But today, I have been profoundly disappointed the way Harvard's inability to stand up for the Jewish community after October 7th. And for me personally, I do not fundamentally believe that it's right for me to wear this today.
Mazel tov, Senator. Well done. Only in America is coming up after the break with a, shall we say, artistic response to Robert De Niro. Welcome back to the program, and now it's time for a little segment we like to call Only in America. Well, this week we all saw the embarrassing spectacle, again, of raging bull Robert De Niro being dragged out of retirement by the Biden White House to have a big old cry about Donald Trump. And I mean, it's all a bit sad. You know, he's a guy who made a name for himself playing a paranoid, delusional lunatic in Taxi Driver, and now he's playing, well, a paranoid, delusional lunatic in real life. But at least some people have a sense of humor about it. Here's New York City artist Scott Labayo unveiling a portrait of De Niro he painted in record time, immortalizing the great one's decline. Have a look.
In response to Robert De Niro's insanity speech yesterday, how this man said that Donald Trump and us are ruining democracy. Meanwhile, everything that's happening in that courtroom is exactly what he said yesterday, but for the other side. This is a travesty. This is unconstitutional. This is ruining democracy. Yes, yes. So in response to Mr. De Niro, I give you my latest masterpiece called Crybaby. Go Citizen Scott. Go Citizen Scott.
Oh, hey, hey, ho, ho. Robert De Niro has got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. Robert De Niro has got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho.
Raging bull indeed. Sorry, Robert, you could have been a contender. That's all the time we have for this week. Bad week for the justice system. Great week for you, I hope. Bye-bye.